Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm your host, Scotty West. Today, finally, we're going to talk about chords. Not every last thing about chords, but at least enough so you can begin to play some songs. This is lesson 4, so make sure you're looking at page 4 in your booklet. You'll also need your fretboard chart and slide rule today. As always, make sure you've been reviewing the previous material. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. We're going to talk about chords today, and you're going to find this maybe a little more pertinent. You know, it was all like the stuff we've learned, I think, so far was a lot of times stuff that people weren't expecting to wind up talking about. I think you thought that I was just going to plop that guitar in your lap right away and start playing chords, but as you've seen, hopefully, there's a lot of stuff you need to know about music. Otherwise, you probably won't be able to satisfy yourself. But today, we're on to some of the good stuff. If you're like most people, your perception probably is that the main role of the guitar in modern popular music is to play these things called chords. Now, what are chords? Well, chords, you know, we're going to talk in depth about chords later on. If you look at your syllabus, you'll see it's actually way down the list. But today we're just going to learn the basic stuff about how to move your fingers on the instrument and what a chord basically is. And a chord, for our purpose at this point now, is to suggest that a chord is when you select several different notes and you play them all simultaneously. You play them all at the same time. And, you know, you've got the guitar and you're strumming your chords and stuff like that. Now, let's look up at the chart here. As always, I have a bunch of stuff that I've got to tell you about chords, some facts about chords. Chords. One of the first things that you would like to know about chords is there are about 45 different types of chords. And they all have, like, different types of names. And you're probably familiar with some of this stuff. You know that there are some chords that are called major chords, and there are other chords called minor chords. And a lot of them have numbers after them, like 7 or 9. Strange words like augmented and diminished and suspended. On and on and on until you get to about 45 different types of chords. Now, the cool thing about all these different types of chords is they all evoke different moods. As we know, music has a lot of emotion in it. All of these different types of chords express different types of moods. And if you're like most people, and one of the things you like most about music is what it does to you emotionally, the more different types of chords you can learn to play, the more subtle shades of emotion you can bring into your music. It's another one of those areas where it could be said that modern popular music, rock and roll, is maybe not quite so broad in that context as a lot of other styles of music would be. For example, in some styles of music, like say hard rock or heavy metal, of the 45 different types of chords that there are, you might only see in any given album, or indeed in any given discography of an entire band, you might not see more than 2 or 3 or 4 different types of chords. Of these 45 different types of chords, I think basically rock and roll players should know probably at least like about half of those. Say about 25 different chords are apt to show up in rock. The total number of 45, you're going to find more in classical and jazz and stuff like that. Okay, so there's 45 different types of chords, and they all express different types of moods. We're not going to be looking at all 45 different types today. We're just going to be looking at 6 types, the 6 most central, shall we say, chords in popular music. We are going to be looking basically at happy-sounding major chords, sad-sounding minor chords. From here on, you might come up with your own terms. You might not necessarily agree with mine, but I think 7 chords sound kind of bluesy, and possibly that's because there's a lot of 7 chords in blues music. We're also going to be looking at minor 7 chords and major 7 chords. And we're also going to be looking at these things called 5 chords, which some of you may know as what are called power chords. These are like the type you see a lot these days in hard rock music, heavy metal, stuff like that, alternative stuff. So, there are about 45 different types of chords. We're going to look at 6 of them for tonight. But for now, let's take a look at just one type of chord, a happy-sounding major chord. Now, here's a question for you. See if you can answer this question. One type of chord, a happy-sounding major chord. But how many major chords must there be? And it would be the same answer for how many minor chords there are and how many 7 chords there are in minor 7s. But there's this thing called a major chord. How many of them are there? Well, the answer is there's 12 of them. You're going to find out that just about everything in music comes in 12s. Why? Because, as you know, there's 12 different notes. And each pattern that you can play in music can be started, if you will, on any one of those 12 notes. So there's 12 different major chords, there's 12 different minor chords, there's 12 different 7 chords. Everything in music comes in 12s. So we've learned that there are about 45 different types of chords. Another interesting thing to know is there are 12 of any type. That's because there are 12 notes. So what that means is when you play music, there are 12 keys that you can play in. Now, what does it mean to play in a key? You've probably heard musicians talking about that they're playing around and then somebody yells out, "Hey, what key is this song in?" So you might be familiar with that concept. What does it mean to play in a particular key? Well, that's actually a rather complex subject that we're going to kind of approach by degrees as we go through this whole program. But one thing you definitely want to know, for now anyway, is that at any given moment in any given song you play, there isn't just one note in that song, is there? You ever heard a song that's just got one note in it? No, songs have like bunches of different notes, and they're all kind of arranging themselves into different types of patterns, chords and scales and the like. And but one thing you should know is somewhere in that song is one note that's acting as kind of like the nucleus for the whole thing. It's like the anchor for the whole song. And once you have determined which of the 12 notes is acting as the anchor note or the nucleus note for that song, then you know what key you're in. And of course, since you have a choice of 12 different notes that could be functioning as that nucleus note, there are in the end 12 different keys that you can play in. That's all you need to know about playing in a key for now. So, remember my question was, here's this thing called a major chord. How many different major chords are there? There's 12. 12 of everything in music. Now, here's the next question I want to ask you. If, in fact, there are 12 different major chords that you'd like to be able to play at some point, why did I only leave room to write down 5 of them? You'll notice on the chart here, I don't, we're going to be looking at major chords in this vertical column here. I didn't write down 12 different boxes. I only wrote down 5. Why is that? Any idea? Another way to frame the question is, if in fact there's 12 different chords, how come it seems that most of the people you ever meet don't know how to play all 12? It seems like most people only know how to play 5 different chords. Why is that? And it seems as though, interestingly enough, that they're always the same 5, too. And if you've been playing guitar for a little while now and you've bought yourself a chord book or something, these may be the 5 chords you know, too. I'll write them down in this column right here. You may recognize this one as a major chord. And you might know this one. And you might know this one. And this one. And this one. There are 12 different major chords, but it seems like most of the time people only know how to play 5 of them, maybe a couple more than that. But why is that? Well, some people say, well, maybe these are the easy ones. These are the ones we learn first because these are the easy ones. And I go, well, that might be part of the equation, but that's not really the whole thing. Other people go, well, maybe these are the most common ones. Maybe these are the ones you see in the songs the most often. And I go, well, that might be partially true too, and that might be related to the first one, that in fact these are the easiest ones. But that isn't really the issue either. It's just an interesting thing, and we've talked a little about this before, but why did I only write down these 5 finger patterns? Well, you see, it turns out, remember we talked last time about the fact that it surprises a lot of people, but there are very profound physical limitations to what you can make your fingers do on this thing we call the guitar. Here's my guitar here. Last time when we were talking about the tuning of the instrument, we said, remember, you can't play every single combination of notes that you might ever want to play on this instrument. For example, let's see you play a chord that's got this note, this note, this note, and this note in it. Can't be done. Physically impossible. So, the answer to our question is this. Why did I only write down these 5 finger shapes for playing major chords on the guitar? Well, the answer is there may, in fact, be 12 different major chords that you'd like to be able to play. But owing to the physical limitations of what's possible on this instrument, there are not 12 unique and individual finger kind of shapes that you would employ to actually play these chords. It turns out, and this is a little bit of an oversimplification that we're going to undo later on, but it turns out if you want to play a major chord on the guitar, there are, in the end, only 5 ways to make your fingers do that. And here they are right there. These are the only 5 fingerings for a major chord on the guitar. It's just impossible to do anything else. So, of course, everyone's next question is, they go, well, what are you telling me then? That the guitar as an instrument is only capable of playing 5 of the 12 chords? Boy, that would be pretty rotten to find that out, wouldn't it? Well, no, actually, that's not what I'm saying at all. Yes, you can play all 12 chords on the guitar. In fact, you could use any one of these 5 finger shapes to play all 12 chords. So not only can you play all 12 chords, there's 5 different ways to play every chord, and let me show you how that works. This chord up here, you may be familiar with. In fact, you may know this as an E major chord. Now, we're not going to quite think of it that way. We're not going to think of it as an E major chord. We're going to think of this as the E form. Whoops. The E form. Now, here's an interesting question. Why do you put your fingers like that on the neck of a guitar to play an E major chord? And a lot of people say, well, that's what the book told me to do, or that's what my next door neighbor's older brother showed me. And I go, well, okay. But why do you put your fingers like that on the neck of a guitar to play an E major chord? Well, remember, music is a language. your guitar is something very much like a typewriter, and an E major chord is something very much like a word. As we said, these pitch patterns in music are like words in the language of music. And this word has a spelling. And when you put your fingers like this on the neck of the guitar, all you're basically doing is getting the typewriter to produce the word that you're trying to spell. Now let me show you what I mean. You remember that the names of your strings on your guitar are E, A, D, G, B, E. And let's take a look at this. Now, we haven't seen this on camera yet before, but this is my famous musical slide rule. You all got one in your support material there, and hopefully you've put the thing together. It looks like this. You're going to be looking at the side now that is labeled chords and arpeggios. And this is a little spelling calculator. It helps you figure out how to spell any particular one of these patterns because it's like a word. Right now we're looking at major triads, which is these three little boxes you'll notice up in the upper left-hand corner right there. And right now we want to play an E major triad because that's actually the example that we're looking at. So all you need to do is slide your slide rule along until right under the word major triad in the box that's labeled number 1, you put an E note. That's how you tell what chord you're playing. You just decide which of the 12 notes is going to be the actual root note or nucleus note or key note for that particular pattern at that time. So we've put E in the first of those three little boxes under the word major triad. And now you'll notice that in the two other boxes are the letters G sharp and B. So what this is telling you is that the spelling, if you will, for this chord that we call an E major chord is actually E, G sharp, and B out of your musical alphabet. Well, now take a look at what you're doing when you put your fingers on the neck of the guitar like this and play an E major chord. I'm strumming the chord and I'm hearing those notes come out. And it sounds nice, and it sounds happy, doesn't it? It sounds like a happy-sounding E major chord. Why did it work that way? Well, remember, the notes that are in an E major chord are E, G sharp, and B. And take a look at the other thing here that we'll look at is this finger chart here for a moment. And I'll put this right under the E major chord box so that you can see what I'm talking about here. Remember, when I just put my fingers on the neck of the guitar, I had, my hand isn't exactly aligned this way, of course, but I had two fingers right here, and then I had another finger back here on this string back here. That's the same as this finger shape right up here, if you can tilt up just a little bit and see that. See, that arrangement of those three dots is the same as where I have my fingers on my finger chart right here. Now, remember, this is a word that I'm trying to type on my instrument, and the letters that are in there, as we saw on the slide rule, are E, G sharp, and B. Now, take a look, and to play an E major chord, an interesting thing to realize is those three notes simply have to be present. They don't have to be in any particular order. They don't have to be in any particular octave, and you can repeat them as you wish or as you need to. So take a look at what notes I'm actually playing when I put my fingers like that. First of all, I don't have any finger at all down on my low E string, do I? Might want to tilt up on that shot, just a little bit on that podium shot so we can see the finger chart and this little box right here. I have my three fingers right like this, and notice I have no fingers at all down here on my low E string. That doesn't mean that nothing's happening there. That just means that when I hit that string, I'm playing the alphabet letter note that that string is tuned to, which of course is E, this low E down here. Now, we certainly know that E is a note that's in an E major chord, right? Well, on the next string, I have my finger on the 2nd fret right there. And if we look at what that note is, that's a B. And we know that we need a B in our E major chord. Now, on the next string, I also have my finger on the 2nd fret. If I move my finger out of the way, you can see that that's an E. So far I'm playing E, B, and E, just like the slide rule told me I should. Now, I'm playing two E's, aren't I? Are they the same note? Listen to them. Play those two E's. Are those the same note? No, actually they're not, are they? One is higher than the other one. If you have two notes that have the same alphabet letter, but they're not the same pitch, one is obviously higher than the other one, what kind of relationship is that in music? Of course, that's what an octave is, isn't it? So we're playing E, B, and the next octave note higher than E as well. Then, my last finger that I actually have on the neck is on the first fret on this string right here, and if you can see that, it's actually a G sharp, which is, of course, the third note that the slide rule told us that was going to be in this chord. Then, on my top two strings up here, you'll notice that I don't have any fingers on those strings. That, again, that doesn't mean that nothing's happening there. A lot of people get that into their head. They think if you don't have your finger on a string, that's some kind of non-event. But that's not true at all. If you don't have a finger on your string and yet you're still strumming that string, it merely means that the instrument is playing that note for you. So we're playing a high B and a high E. So when I put my fingers like this on the neck of the guitar, I'm trying to spell that very word that I saw here on the slide rule, which, as you'll recall, is E, G sharp, and B. And sure enough, to put my fingers like that, I was creating the word E, B, E, G sharp, B, and E. I played 3 different E's, all of them an octave apart from one another. I played 2 different B's right there and right there. Those 2 notes were an octave apart, and I played 1 G sharp. So that's why my fingers are like that. The guitar is a typewriter, and that's how I spell the word E, G sharp, B, and that is how an E major chord is structured. Exactly the same thing is true with all these other chords. Why do I put my fingers like that to play an A major chord? Music is a language, the guitar is a typewriter, an A major chord is a word, and it too has a spelling. If we look at the slide rule here again, slide this, we find that an A major chord is spelled A, C sharp, and E. And I won't bother to take the time, but if you look on your finger chart and notice what notes I'm playing right there, you'll notice that every one of them is either an A, a C sharp, or an E. There's no mystery to how any of this stuff works at all. You're going to have to do some homework. You're going to have to do some memorizing. But there really isn't anything terribly complicated about figuring this stuff out. If you look at your fretboard chart and you know where your alphabet letter notes are, then and then look at the slide rule to figure out how the spelling of these different patterns is, you could practically figure out how to finger these chords yourself, couldn't you? I mean, in the end, did anyone have to teach you specifically how to spell the word cat on a typewriter? I mean, you knew how the language worked, you knew the alphabet, you knew that the word cat was spelled C-A-T, so didn't you pretty much just walk up to the typewriter and go, oh, I get it, I bet if I go ch-ch-ch, that'll be C-A-T, and I'll be spelling the word cat. If you know that an A major chord is A, C sharp, and E, and you wind up looking at your finger chart right here, you'd practically be able to figure out yourself where to put your fingers. Now, I'm not going to put you through that. I'm going to show you all the fingerings just to save time, but the interesting thing is you actually, in many ways, would be able to, you'd be able to actually figure all that stuff out yourself. So, back to our question, which was, we've now learned that we put our fingers like that on the neck of the guitar to play an E major chord because that's how it's spelled. But remember, we said there are 12 of any type, but I only put down these 5 different finger shapes because, owing to the physical limitations of the instrument, these are the only ways that you can get your fingers to play E major chord on the guitar. So this begs the question, well, how am I supposed to play the other chords that make up the 12? Well, I'm going to show you that now. This is an E major chord, isn't it? Now think about your musical alphabet for a moment. What would be the name of the very next major chord higher in pitch than an E major chord? Can you tell me? The next major chord higher than an E major chord. Well, it would be, if you're looking at your musical alphabet, it would be the next alphabet letter in the musical alphabet that's higher than E. And that, of course, is F. You might have been thinking E sharp or F flat, but then if you look at your chart, you remember, oh yeah, that's one of those places where there is no sharp and flat between the 2 notes. So the very next note higher than E is F. What that means is the very next major chord higher than an E major chord is an F major chord. And how do you play an E major chord? So far, all we have are these: E, A, D, C, and G. So there's no F chord here. How do we play an F chord? Well, remember, an F major chord is the next major chord higher than an E major chord. Let's take a look at the slide rule again here. Remember, our spelling for an E major chord, let's set the slide rule up so that we can see how to spell an E major triad. You might recall that those notes were E, G sharp, and B. Now, what if we want to play an F major chord? Well, obviously, E can't be note number 1 anymore. If we want to play an F major chord, F has to be note number 1. So we're going to have to move the slide rule up 1. So I have now slid my slide rule up so that F is the alphabet letter in the first window there. But what you'll also notice is the other 2 letters went up 1 too, didn't they? We were playing E, G sharp, and B, but then I slid the slide rule up, and now we're seeing that the 3 letters that show up in there are the next higher of each of those 3 notes, which is F, A, and C. That's the spelling for an F major chord. Now we have to figure out how to type that on our typewriter. So we grab the guitar again here. This was an E major chord, wasn't it? I had my fingers right like that. Now, to play an F major chord, what we just discovered is that, one way to think of it anyway is I have to take the notes that are in an E major chord and I have to raise them all up by 1 note. How would I do that on the neck of my guitar? Well, a lot of people go, oh, I bet I see how that works. If this is an E major chord, to play an F major chord, what I have to do is raise all of those notes up 1. Oh, I'll take my fingers like this and I'll move them all up 1 fret. Like that. Wouldn't that be true? Didn't I just take the notes in that E major chord and raise them all up 1 by raising them all up 1 fret on the neck of the guitar? Here was the E again. And to play an F, I raise those notes up by 1 fret. But there's a little bit of a problem. Let me show you. Let's listen to the E major chord again. Now that was a happy, normal sounding chord, wasn't it? Just like we would expect a major chord to sound. Remember we said major chords sound happy. Problem is when I go to play this F major chord and I raise everything up 1 fret and then I strum the strings, listen to this chord now. Wow, that's kind of interesting sounding, isn't it? But it sure doesn't sound very happy and normal anymore, does it? It sounds kind of eerie and weird. What happened? Boy, that was supposed to be an F major chord. That was supposed to be just a happy sounding, normal sounding chord, just maybe slightly higher in pitch than the E major chord. How did we not only raise the stuff up, but get it to sound completely different? Weird. Here's the E major chord again. Happy and normal sounding. Here's the F major chord, very weird and eerie sounding. Why did that happen? Well, the reason is we didn't actually accomplish what we set off to do just then. Yes, it's true. If you want to play an F major chord, what you do is you take the notes that are in an E major chord and you raise them all up 1 fret or up 1 note. But I actually didn't do that if you think about it. When I was strumming this E chord, I was strumming all 6 strings, wasn't I? However, I only have my fingers on 3 of these strings. So when I raised these 3 fingers up 1 fret, I didn't raise all of the notes that were in that chord. I only raised the 3 notes that my fingers were actually playing on the 3 strings that my fingers were on. The reason that this chord sounds so weird and eerie is I didn't raise all the notes up in this chord. I only raised the ones that my fingers were on. These 3 open strings, your 2 on the top and your 1 on the bottom down here, they're still stuck back where they were when we were playing the E major chord. They're still playing E, B, and E. So this is a rather confused chord because half of it's an E major chord, But the other, I mean, half of it's an F major chord, but the other half of it's still stuck back in E. This is like two chords being played at the same time. That's why it sounds so weird. In order for me to turn an E major chord into an F major chord, I have to raise all 6 of the notes that are in this chord, not just the 3 that my fingers are on. How the heck do you do that? Remember, the open strings are not a non-event. They're just as much a part of the chord as anything else you do. So in order for me to turn an E major chord into an F major chord, not only do I have to raise up the notes that my fingers are on, I have to figure out a way to raise the pitches of the open strings. And how do I do that? Well, this is what bar chords are all about. And you might have heard of bar chords, other guitar players talking about them and also complaining how difficult they are for certain players to play. Well, what is a bar chord? Well, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using your finger as a bar to go all the way across the neck like that. Let's go back to our E major chord again. In order for me to play an F major chord, what I have to do is notice right now that I am using my index finger, but I'm not using my pinky. My pinky's flying up in the air here. To play an F major chord in the E form, what I have to do is rearrange my fingers so that I'm still playing that chord, but now I'm employing my pinky and I'm not employing my index finger. You can see my index finger is free here. I'm playing the same notes. I'm using different fingers to do that. Now, in order for me to play an F major chord in the E form, first thing was right. We have to raise these 3 fingers up 1 fret. But then the other thing we have to do is we have to take this bar finger and lay it all the way across the neck of the guitar to raise up the pitches of the open strings. See, now I'm not playing any open strings at all. I'm now playing this low note and these 2 high notes on the 1st fret using the bar to play them. Now, listen to this F major chord. Now it sounds happy and normal, doesn't it? Just slightly higher than the E major chord, which was 1 down. Now remember this, when I played E originally, and I moved it up to what I thought was F, and I didn't put the bar across, I got this strange, eerie sounding chord. That's because I hadn't raised the pitches of the open strings. Now listen when I put the bar across. It becomes a normal kind of sounding chord. Here it is with the bar. Here it is without the bar. So, to play the next higher chord, you have to raise all the notes in that chord. And the best way to do that is go up the neck with your fingers. But then remember, you have to raise the open strings too, and that's what the bar in a bar chord does. We're not done yet. If this was an E major chord, if I raised everything up 1, it became an F major chord. Now here's the next question. What if I take this finger shape and I move it all up 1 fret again? What's that? That's an F sharp major chord. A lot of people have not made the connection that there are chords rooted on the sharp and flat notes too. We know that we can play an A, we know that we can play a D, we know that we can play a C, but a lot of people don't know that there is actually a C sharp chord. There's also an A flat chord, and there's a D sharp chord. A chord, or indeed any pattern, can be rooted on any one of the 12 notes. So what you might have figured out by now is if I just know this E form, this E fingering right here, then if I understand the concept of the bar chord, I can use that 1 finger shape to play all 12 chords. This was E, raise it up 1, put the bar across, F, raise it up again, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp. Finally, all the way up to my double dotted fret up here, which you might recall is your octave fret. That's my 12th fret. I'd be back to E again because that is 1 octave higher than when I was down here at the bottom. Notice how they have the same basic kind of pitch sound. But this one's obviously higher than this one is down here. So using that one form, the E form, I can play all 12 chords. And back to the slide rule again here, all that means is each time I'm just kind of sliding up in my spelling of the notes. An E major chord was E, G sharp, and B. I raised it all up to F, which is F, A, C. I raised it up again to F sharp, which is F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. Then I raised it up to G, which is G, B, D. Each time, all I was doing was raising the notes up in that chord by one note, by raising them up the neck of the guitar by one fret. Now, a bunch of you probably already knew something about that. You probably already knew that you could do that with the E form. But what a lot of people don't understand is you can also do that with all of these other four forms, totaling 5. You know, why do you put your fingers like this to play an A major chord? Because music is a language, and an A major chord is a word you're trying to spell on your typewriter, and that's how you put your fingers to play an A major chord. I have all this stuff memorized. I won't look at the slide rule again. That's A, C sharp, and E. That's the spelling for an A major chord. So if that's A, what is the next major chord higher than A? It's not B. Remember, there's sharp and flat chords, too. So the very next chord higher than an A major chord is an A sharp major chord. How would I play that? Well, one way to think of it is take your A major chord and raise the notes in it up by one note or by one fret on your neck. So again, we take that chord, we raise it up one fret. Oh, but it sounds really weird and eerie again. What happened? We forgot to put our bar on, didn't we? Because we didn't raise the pitches of the open strings. Here's your A. Here's this weird sounding chord. Now look what happens if I just put the bar across on the first fret. Now it's got that normal, pretty, happy sound that we expect from a major chord. Here it is with the bar. Here it is without it. So if this is A, and this is A sharp, what's this? Up another fret. That's got to be the next higher one, right? Which is B. And then, what's the next one? Is it B sharp? Nope, remember I fooled you. That's the other place in the musical alphabet where there is no sharp and flat between two alphabet letters, B and C. What's the other place? E and F. So this was A, this is A sharp, B flat, B, then to C, then to C sharp, and then to D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, finally back to A, and I suppose I can even keep going above that too, up maybe almost another whole octave. So, as you can see, we're not going to think of this as being an A major chord here. We're going to think of this as being the A form. And what we've just discovered is that if you understand how your bar chords work, then you could use that one finger shape, that A form major chord, to play all 12 major chords if you just keep moving it up the neck and putting the bar across to replace the open strings. You can do exactly the same thing with D. A lot of people don't know that. It's not quite as common, but we're not going to think of this as a D major chord anymore. We're going to think of it as the D form. And if you know how your bar chord works, you can use that shape to play all 12 of the major chords. You'll just be playing them in the D form. You can also use C shape. So we're going to think of this as being the C form. And finally, very uncommon as a full bar chord, but G form as well can be turned into a bar chord and moved up the neck to play all 12 chords. So, back over to this side of the chart, just to fill in a couple of things. Remember, there's 45 different types of chords. We said there are 12 of any type. That's because there are 12 different notes that you can root a chord on. The other thing we learned is there are not 12 unique, owing to the physical limitations of the instrument, there are not 12 unique and individual finger shapes to play these chords with. There are only 5. There are only 5 basic possible, underline the word possible, finger forms. And they are E form, A form, D form, C form, and G form. Now, some of you may bump into, there are some other alternate naming systems that they use for these forms, too. These are the ones I like. It seems to connect with people better. 5 basic possible finger forms, E, A, D, C, and G. But that doesn't mean you can't play all 12 chords. That means that, in fact, you can play all 12 chords, and you could play all 12 chords using any one of these 5 forms. So not only can you play all 12 chords, you can play any given chord 5 different ways. There are 5 ways to play any chord. And that's what bar chords are all about. And remember, all you're doing when you're playing a bar chord is you're using your bar finger to replace what the open strings would have played in these different open, what they call open tuning chords down at the bottom of the neck. So there's 5 ways to play any chord. This is not the only way to play an E major chord. Let's listen to that E major chord. Now, right now, I'm playing E in the E form. But as we learned a moment ago, I ought to be able to play an E major chord in the A form as well. I just have to take my A chord, turn it into a bar chord, and move it up the neck the appropriate number of frets. So this started off as A. I move it up 1 fret. What is it? A sharp, and then B, and then C, and then C sharp, and then D, and then D sharp, and I get up to the 7th fret, and this becomes an E major chord. It's just that I'm now playing it in the A form. So this chord up here is E major in the A form. This chord down here is E in the E form. Now listen to these 2 chords. Do they sound absolutely the same? No, they don't. They sound kind of different, do they? Don't they? There are some differences between those 2 chords. But on the other hand, do they sound completely different, like they don't have anything to do with each other at all? No, actually, they have some similarities as well, don't they? So these 2 different ways of playing an E major chord, there's certain things that make those 2 chords sound similar, and there's other 2 things that make them sound different. Let's start off with why they sound similar. Why do those 2 versions of an E major chord sound similar? Well, remember, these are words, and they have spellings, and if I'm playing the chord correctly, these 2 chords sound similar because they have the same basic alphabet letter spelling. Remember when we looked at the slide rule, you might recall that an E major chord was spelled E, G sharp, and B. And turns out that either way I put my fingers, those are the notes I'm playing. You can check that out on your finger chart if you want. In both cases, I was playing nothing but E's, G sharps, and B's. So that's why those 2 chords sounded similar. But remember, the other question is, well, if they have exactly the same notes in them, or they have the same alphabet letter spelling, why don't they sound exactly alike? What is it that accounts for the differences in the way these 2 different chords sound? Well, remember what we said before, that in order for that pattern to qualify as an E major chord, those notes simply had to be present. E, G sharp, and B. They didn't have to be in any particular order. They didn't have to be in any particular octave, and I could repeat them or not repeat them as I wish. So, the reason these sound similar is they're both spelled E, G sharp, and B. The reasons that they sound different are, well, as you can see, I've gone further up the neck. This was way down at the bottom of the neck. So, this one maybe sounds a little bit higher. Certain of the notes in this are higher than when I was playing them down here. So maybe I took the notes and booted them up by an octave. Maybe I changed the order that they were in. Maybe I changed which of the notes I was repeating. Remember, in the E down here, I played 3 different E's, all an octave apart. When I'm playing it up here, I'm not playing 3 E's anymore. I'm only playing 2 E's. I'm only repeating E twice. So the reason these sound different is, even though they have the same alphabet letter spelling, the notes have been rearranged a little. Certain of them are not repeated the same way, and they've been moved up or down by an octave. Now, we have seen how to play E major in the E form. We've seen how to play E major in the A form. We can also use this shape to play an E major chord. It starts off as a D, as many of you already know. This is a D major chord. Why? Because that's how a D major chord is spelled. I could haul the slide rule out again. You might try this at home. Take that little major triad place up in the left-hand corner. Now slide the rule so that the letter D is in window number 1, right under the M in major. And you'll notice that the spelling for a D major chord is D, F sharp, and A. That's exactly what I'm doing when I'm putting my fingers like that. I'm playing D, A, D, F sharp, repeating 2 Ds, 1 A, and 1 F sharp. Now, our chord in question here is an E major chord. We saw that we could play it in E form, we can play it in A form, we can also play it in D form by turning it into a bar chord and moving it up the neck the appropriate number of frets. In this case, we don't have to go very far, do we? If we want to turn a D chord into an E chord, all we have to do is D, raise it up 1, put the bar across, and that's D sharp, raise it up another fret, and that's E. So this is E in the D form. Listen to this. Now here's E in the E form. Here's E in the A form. I can do the same thing with C form. I can take my C chord, rearrange my fingers so that I'm not using my index finger, raise everything up 1 fret, put the bar across to raise up the pitches of the open strings. What chord would that be? C sharp, right? It started off as a C chord. I raised everything up 1 fret, C sharp. I can raise it up again. What would it be? D, raise it up again, D sharp, raise it up again, E. So here's an E major chord being played in the D form. Once again, it has a lot of similarities to the other ways we played an E major chord in the different forms. I can also take G form. Although you don't see this very often, but just to prove my point, you can take a G major chord, rearrange your fingers so your index finger is free, raise everything up 1 fret, put the bar across down here on the 1st fret. That's a real stretch, isn't it? That's why you don't see this happening too much. What chord would that be? G sharp. I started with a G, I raised it up 1, G sharp, move it up again, A, move it up again, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp. Here's an E major chord. I'm way up the neck this time, aren't I? This is an E major chord being played in the G form. Let's listen to all 5 of them. Here's E in the E form. Here's E in the A form. Here's E in the D form. Here's E in the C form. Here's E in the G form. 5 different ways of playing the same chord if you understand what bar chords are and how they work. And that's pretty much it right there. So, just to quickly recap over here, remember, there's 45 different types of chords. There's 12 of any type. But there's only 5 basic possible finger forms: the E form, the A form, the D form, and the C form, and the G form. That's owing to what we know about the physical limitations of what's possible with your fingers on this instrument. But that doesn't mean you can't play all 12 chords. If you understand how bar chords work, you find out that not only can you play all 12 chords, but there's actually 5 ways to play any chord. You can play any one of those major chords in any one of those 5 different forms. Now, the interesting thing to realize is that that's not just true of major chords in this column right here. You can also do the same thing with minor chords, and you may know some of these minor chord shapes too. Remember, in E form, we're going to be going across the page right there. So we looked at a major chord in the E form. Here's a minor chord in the E form. So that's E minor. Here's A minor. Now these are sad sounding chords, and the thing to realize is these can be turned into bar chords and moved up and down the neck just as easily as the major chords we just looked at. That's A minor. Here's D minor. Here's C minor. This is not a very commonly used shape in pop music, pop rock music, but we'll be talking a little bit more about that at some point. Here's G minor. Like that, and I'll tell you some more about that in a minute. You can take any one of these chords and turn it into a bar chord. Here's a sad-sounding chord, E minor, played in the E form. Doesn't that sound sad? Here's the major chord version of the same chord. Sounds happy. Here's the minor version. Sounds sad. That's E minor played in the E form. What would be the next minor chord higher than an E minor chord? It would be F minor, right? How do I play F minor? I take the notes that are in an E minor chord and I raise them all up by one note, by one fret on the neck of my guitar. So remember, what I have to do is rearrange my fingers so that I'm not using my index finger. Raise these up one fret, put the bar across on the first fret to bring up the pitches of the open strings. F minor. Raise it up again. F sharp minor. Raise it up again. G minor. G sharp minor. A minor. A sharp minor. B minor. C minor. C sharp minor. D minor. D sharp minor. Finally back to E minor. I can do the same with A minor. This is A minor. Turn it into a bar chord. Move it up one fret. A sharp minor. B minor, C minor, C sharp minor, D minor. Now I'm just playing them all in the A form. I could do the same thing with all of these different minor chords. There's 5 ways to play any particular minor chord, too. Now, the next types of chords we're looking at are these bluesy-sounding 7 chords. Here's an E7. This can just as easily be turned into a bar chord and moved up the neck. Here's a A7. Here's a D7. Here's a C7. This is the first one on the page, non-bar chord on the page so far, where you have to use all 4 fingers. That one may give you a little bit of trouble in the beginning. Here's a G7. Any of these can be turned into bar chords and moved up and down the neck to play in all 12 keys. Here's some minor 7 chords. These are chords that sound, kind of sound sad and bluesy at the same time. Here's an E minor 7. Easiest chord on the whole page. One lousy finger, 2nd fret on your A string, minor 7. Here's A minor 7. Here's D minor 7. Here's one way, anyway, to play a C minor 7. These are, again, like I said, the minors and minor 7s in the C and G form are not anywhere near as common as in maybe some other styles of music. And, of course, then G minor 7 could also be played like this. Major 7s, which are very peaceful and mellow sounding chords, very pastoral kind of sounding chords. This is, I'm going to skip that major 7 there for a second. I'm going to go to A form first. This is an A major 7. And this is a D major 7. And you'll notice you have all of these on the chart in your booklet there. So if I'm going through these too fast, you can just look at the chart yourself that you have in front of you. C major 7 and G major 7. Finally, in the last column here, for all you hard rock type people, these are going to turn out to be some of your favorite chords. These are the ones that you see in heavy metal and alternative and hard rock music. These are called 5 chords or power chords. They have a very characteristic shape like this. The interesting thing about these chords, for reasons that are too complicated to go into right now, in these chords, you don't play the upper strings of the chord. You only play the strings that your fingers are actually on. So I'm going to put X's up above here. I'm going to X off those strings. We're going to come back and talk about those X's in a couple of minutes too. You don't always strum all of your strings when you play a chord on the guitar. That surprises people sometimes. They thought, gee, I thought I was always going to be strumming all 6 strings. No, probably more often than not you don't strum all 6 strings. You only strum 3 in this case. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5, sometimes only 2, interestingly enough. But anyway, that's a 5 chord or a power chord played in the E form. Take a look at how in this chord, in this A form version of this chord, it's really the same basic finger shape as that. It's just that everything's been moved over one string. Now, in this case, we don't play our low E string. That's why it has a little X over it. And you don't play your 2 top strings either. So that's what these little X's mean. You try to sneak your pick in there so that you don't actually hit those strings right there. Now, an interesting thing is, take a look at how this finger shape for a 5 chord, a power chord, is the same as this finger shape for a power chord. This is just in the E form, and this is in the A form here. Maybe that shouldn't come as any great surprise. It's a 5 chord, so it should have the same relationship of notes to one another. It's just that since the strings of the guitar are all tuned basically the same way, 4 notes apart as we learned in our previous lesson, then maybe it shouldn't surprise us that we could take that whole finger shape and move it over one string and still have it function the same way. So, does that mean that if I move it over again, over to the next 3 strings there, that it's going to have that same shape? With these 2 notes here? And then is the 3rd note going to be right there, the way it was up here? And the answer is no, it's not. We're going to see a slightly different change in this shape here now. And why is that? That's because you might recall that these are those 2 strings that are tuned a different distance apart on the neck of the guitar. These 2 strings are tuned a different distance apart than all the other strings are. And remember, there's only 3 notes in between those, and what that means is that we're going to come back and talk about this more later on, but whenever you're trying to translate like a chord shape across the neck, whenever a particular note winds up on your B string, that is your next to your highest string, the note that's on that string has to be raised by 1 fret in order to compensate for that missing note in the tuning of the instrument. So actually a D form 5 chord looks like that. That note, which would have normally been right there, had to be raised up 1 in order to compensate for that missing thing. In G form then, if you go over to here, this note has to go up to here, and then this one has to follow suit. It has to retain its original relationship that it had down here. Now you're also going to see there's a similar relationship between these 3 chords. See this E form major chord and this A form major chord? In a way, they're really the same note shape. So how come the finger shape for these 2 chords is different? Well, in the case of the A form, what we did is we moved everything over 1 string like we did over here. And when we did, this note right here, which wound up then on the B string, had to be raised by 1 fret. And that's why that note is on, in this form here, that's why that note is on the same fret with the other 2, whereas here it was only right there. This is also how the shape would look if you moved it up again. And we'll be going into that later too. So, here on this page is a very basic vocabulary of guitar chords that everybody needs to understand. It's not going to happen this week or this month or even this year, but over the next 3 years, you've got to learn to master all of the chords on this page. You need to also master them as bar chord versions, which is going to be very difficult. You're going to have a hard time learning to play bar chords. It might be a year or 2 from now before you're ever really very good at playing them at all. You've got to master all these chord shapes. You've got to master them all as bar chords. And what we're going to talk about next time is you need to be able to get there like that. Your fingers have to get there instantly, and that's going to take a lot of practice for you to get to the point where you can actually do that. One last fact that we need to understand about guitar chords or chords in general, is this: every chord you ever play has what's called its root note. All chords have roots. Remember, we talked about how every pattern, every song has that nucleus note in it. Every chord has a nucleus note. It's known as its root note. All chords have roots. What is the root note of the chord? The root note of the chord is the lowest note that you're playing that has the same name as the chord has. It's the lowest note that has the same name as the chord has. So if we're playing this E major chord right here, the root note of the chord is going to be the lowest E note that we can play. And where is that going to be? It's going to be your low E string. That's the lowest E note that you can play. So we'll put a little R over there. That's the root note of that chord right there. Whenever you play any chord, it's always very important to know where the root note of the chord is. In an A chord, the root note is the lowest A you can play, where's that? Well, it's your open A string, so we'll put a little R over that to indicate where the root note is in that chord. In D form, the lowest D you can play on the guitar is your open D string, so we're going to put an R there, too. In C form, we don't have an open C string, do we? So the root note of the C chord is the lowest C that we're playing, and that turns out to be this note right here. So our root note is on our A string there, too. In G form, this is our root note. This is the lowest G we can play. So our root note is on that string. The thing you need to understand about root notes, this is not a hard and fast rule, but this is just something that you want to kind of think about it for now, is generally when you're playing chords, don't play notes that are lower than the root. Every house wants to be built on a good foundation. So does every chord you want to play. Each chord you want to play wants to be built on a good foundation. It wants to have a good, strong launching pad, and that launching pad is its root note. So make sure when you're playing these chords that you know where your root note is, and you don't want to play notes that are lower than that root. So, for example, in A-form chords, you don't play your low A string, because those would be notes that are lower than the root. So that's why I X'd them off. In D-form, you don't play either of your two bottom strings, because your root note is on your D string, and both of those would be notes that are lower than your root note D. In all of your D-form chords, as a general rule, you're not playing either of your bottom strings. In C-form, since your root note is on your A string, you don't play the notes that are on your low E string. You'll notice on your charts at home that all of those C-form chords have an X over the low E string. However, in G-form, you are more apt to play all of your 6 strings because your root note's on your low E string. So remember, you've got to learn to play all of these different chords. You've got to be able to play them as bar chords, and you need to be able to get your fingers just like that. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. We're actually going to be talking about how to practice chords, and we're also going to talk a little bit about strumming so that you can actually learn to articulate these particular chords too. So anyway, that's it. We've got a lot more to talk about on chords, and we'll be doing that later if you look at your syllabus down the list. But for now, that's all you basically need to know. And we'll wrap it up for today and get in there and practice these, and we'll see you again next time on Absolutely Understand Guitar. Okay? Have fun. Enjoy. We'll see you next time.